Hi folks, welcome to today's edition of our videocast, My Life with Robert Burns. We're pleased you could join us. Douglas Mackenzie and Jim Thompson here again to have a blether with another of our cronies. Hi Jim, how are you?
Absolutely great, Douglas, doing fine. Hi everybody.
Today we're joined by the joint editor of the Burns Encyclopaedia, a book which is essential to many Burnsians, and I've actually always got it beside me here. So it's a book I really enjoy. Cronies everywhere, to tell us about his life with Robert Burns, please welcome Professor David Purdie.
Good morning everybody.
Hi David. Perhaps you could just start by telling us a little bit about yourself.
Well, like Burns himself, I'm an Ayrshire boy, born and raised at Prestwick on the coast of Ayrshire, educated locally at Ayr Academy, where the English master, whom I recall with great pleasure, introduced myself and my colleagues to the poet and his life and work. And in fact, that master, Douglas, was the successor by a long way of John Murdoch, who was the tutor to young Burns himself and his brother Gilbert when he was taken on. Murdoch was taken on by William Burnes, the poet's father, to tutor the boys and the children of other farmers roundabout in Alloway. Yeah. And then Ayr Academy on to the university in Glasgow, where I was a medical student. And from there on into a medical academic career, lecturer, senior lecturer, and so on, looking after my patients and doing medical research until retirement in 2008. But all the time, keeping on my interest in 18th century Scotland, its history, and particularly the literature of Scotland, Burns, Waterscott, and David Hume. Yeah.
And did that interest start at school?
Very much so. I mean, the Ayr Academy was only, what, two miles from the poet's birthplace at Alloway. And we were introduced to not just to the poetry, but also to the songs of Burns, and to the biography of the poet by a number of the masters at the school. And so Burns was a neighbour of ours from the very earliest days. And also back at home in Prestwick, my dad, who was with the Scottish Aviation Company building aircraft at the factory at Prestwick Airfield. He was the chairman of the local Burns Club there, made up of the engineers and the staff and the test pilots of Scottish Aviation. So I learned a lot about Burns both at school and at home, yeah.
And apart from having that interest in Burns from an early age, did you have any other hobbies or interests at school?
Very much so. Well, very sporting school. Ayr Academy was one of the great academic powerhouses of Scotland, not just in academia. Almost everybody went on to college or university after leaving school, but also a great sporting school. And 3 years ahead of me, for example, there were 3 men in the first 15 of our rugby team who went on to captain the country, and in different sports. Ian McLaughlin went on to captain Scotland at rugby. Ian Muir went on to captain Dundee, and then Arsenal, and then Scotland at football. And then we had that rarest of all birds, Mike Donness, who went on to captain Kent and then at cricket. So it was a great education, and all of us remember the school, I'm sure, with great pleasure and gratitude.
And your career in medicine, did that take you away from Scotland at all?
Very much so, yeah. In research, medical research, my field was the diagnosis and detection of osteoporosis, which is the dreadful brittle bone problem that afflicts many of our older people, mostly women, but also men as well. And so in all fields of medical research, you have to present your results to critical audiences at home and abroad. And so, yes, I did that. And of course, that led into the work that I've done with Burns in terms of speaking about him, because all university teachers know perfectly well that the audience, that is the students, love it if there are good images to go along with the text of the speech itself or the lecture itself. And so I didn't see why the immortal memory, for example, or the toast to the lasses should not be accompanied by good images. And of course, there were plenty now to hand, because here in Edinburgh, the National Archive of Images is kept by Historic Scotland and amounts to almost 500,000 images of Scotland's history, her geography, her geology, and the lives of her ordinary people down the centuries, and including, of course, the lives of her extraordinary people, one of whom, of course, is Burns. And so,
and is that library of images accessible to anyone?
No, but it's certainly available free of charge to teachers of primary and secondary education and to scholars in colleges and universities like me. And for a small charge, ordinary members of the public can have access to the full set of images. And some of these you're about to see when we talk about Burns in a moment or two, Jim and Douglas. But there's one wonderful requirement if these images are being used, and that is that these images are freed of copyright on one condition, that the occasion when they are used is an educational one. So if anybody is tuned in the hope of some entertainment, well, tough. It's educational, and it's meant to be. But these images are an indispensable resource for anybody speaking about anything to do with Scotland. And in fact, we are perhaps unique in Europe at having this wonderful resource at our fingertips to help us to discuss our country and its remarkable history.
Tremendous. Well, perhaps we could talk a little bit about other things that you've done in relation to Burns before we look at some of these images. And I'll get Jim to talk to you a little bit about that.
Well, first of all, David, you've explained where you started with Burns, but I think given you're sitting there with a bow tie on, I think you should explain that perhaps to the watchers.
Well, first of all, it's a pleasure to have a bow tie on. In fact, to have any tie on for the first time in many, many months, because we're, of course, still in lockdown as we fight off the dreadful COVID-19 virus. This is the tie of the Crichton Fencibles, which is the recreation in the 20th century, now in the 21st, of course, of the club to which Burns belonged in the 18th century in Edinburgh. The Crichton Fencibles were a wonderfully noisy group of scholars and individuals from the professions across Edinburgh who ate, drank, and talked together from probably about 1770 to the 1790s was their major 2 decades of activity. And it was decided back in the 1990s that we should recreate this grand bunch of characters under the colonelship, if I can put it that way. That is the chairmanship of Ian Duncan, who was a surgeon at Ninewells Hospital in Dundee. And here we are, still alive today.
Wonderful. And just in everyday terms, I know you've spoken at thousands of Burns suppers, but I've got a memory of you speaking with an old colleague of mine, and I just can't remember his name. He was a chief inspector at large police office at one time. Maybe you can enlighten me, because I forget his name now. It's terrible.
I will never forget his name. That you're speaking about John Elliott.
John Elliott.
Chief Inspector John Elliott of the then Strathclyde Police Force, one of the wittiest and most eloquent speakers about Burns that I ever came across. And sadly, he died in the late 1990s, but left a memory of how to do it, how to engage an audience, and how to entertain and instruct an audience, which I was very happy to follow myself. Yeah, he was huge value.
Yeah, I remember John. But now you mention the name, obviously it comes back to me fresh. But I mean, you've become basically best known and probably famous for your delivery of immortal memories and lectures using these images, and it would be wrong of us to have you on here and not give you the opportunity to show that to a wider audience, if that's possible. Could you maybe do some of that for us?
Yes, I certainly will do that. And the fact that you've mentioned John Elliott just takes me back to perhaps the nicest compliment that he and I ever had, and that was in Fife, in the coastal town of Anstruther, fishing port on the East Neuk of Fife, for those who are watching who are not from Scotland. John Elliott and I would often operate in tandem together. He would do the immortal memory and I the lassies, or I would do the immortal memory and he would do the lassies. And we were at a place called the Crow's Nest Hotel, a Grand Hotel in Anstruther. And we were approached by the skipper of one of the scallop dredgers operating out of the harbour in Anstruther, who said to us, John, David, I'm very pleased to see you here tonight. I'm here with my crew. We were supposed to be at sea, but we heard it was you, Chief Inspector, and the Professor. We decided after a meeting of the crew that we would wait till the next tide, and we would come to the Burns Supper. So very good to see you here. And I said, Skipper, you've made our day. Thank you. And we look forward to seeing you after the memory's over.
Excellent.
Happy memory. Yes. And Jim, to answer your question, yes, I have with me some of the images which we've assembled over the years, and we keep refining and improving to tell the story of Burns and his life, work, and of course his legacy today.
Well, please feel free, because having seen at a Burns supper, having sat through an immortal memory by the famous Professor Purdie, using slides and things, I just found it wonderful, and it'd be great if the audience could get a wee shot at seeing something as classic in real terms.
Thank you very much, Jim. I'm very happy to do that. I've brought the images with me in 5 sections. I'll put them up section by section. They follow the poet's life in general terms, from his childhood to his legacy after his death. And perhaps after each of them, we can have a discussion about what you've seen and what are the implications of the images themselves.
Excellent.
So to begin, Douglas, Jim, and ladies and gentlemen watching, here is the poet as he was imaged by his great friend, Alexander Naismith. This is the painting which was made after the poet's death in 1796 by Naismith, one of our greatest painters, by the way, of the 18th century. And he has placed the poet on the banks of the River Doon, with the bridge in the background, as you can see, over which Tam O'Shanter made his famous escape. So from the Ayrshire years of Burns's life,
okay,
this first image here is the earliest that we have of the farm of Loch Lee, where the poet spent his early manhood. From the age of 18 to 26, he farmed here with his father, his brothers and sisters, and his mum on the fields of Ayrshire. And it was here that he learned the art and the craft of animal husbandry and arable farming, learning also the art and craft of personal relationships with the farmers' daughters roundabout, who were the first of his girlfriends. And this is an interesting image, because the lady on the left is holding in her right hand, if you look closely, you'll see she's holding what's known as a cutty stool. Now, the stool that she's holding is a milking stool, but cutty in Old Scots simply means short, as we'll see later in Cutty Sart. The short stool had 2 meanings, of course, in Ayrshire. One was the milking stool, as you see here, and the other was in the kirk, because Burns was to fall foul of the kirk during his years in Ayrshire, and for the good old cause, as he puts it, because the kirk was extremely strong about premarital relationships, especially if they resulted in a premarital pregnancy. And this image here simply illustrates the devout Calvinism which held sway in the kirk at Mauchline, which was Burns's own kirk, under the Reverend Daddy Auld, who was a severe Calvinist. And you may remember the famous definition of Calvinism. Calvinism is the suspicion that somebody somewhere might be happy. And the illustration of Calvinism, which I use in the Immortal Memory, which I think describes what happened to Burns, was from this guy. This is David Allen, who was Burns's own favorite painter of his own lifetime. David Allen was a wonderfully witty man, much like Burns himself. The two of them sadly never met, but Burns had 1 or 2 paintings by Allen in his own home in Dumfries in the latter years. And here is David Allen working, he's painting actually a small statue of Apollo of Borghese in Italy, where he did his training. But this is the painting which illustrates what I wanted to say about Burns at Ayrshire. The kirk got very upset with the fact that Burns's affection for jean armour and Jean Armour's affection for Burns had resulted in this, shall we say, pre-contraceptive age in pretty obvious developments which had got to the attention of the Kirk through an elder called Willie Fisher, known later as Holy Willie, whose poem about him by Burns being one of the finest examples of character assassination in the language. Anyway, what David Allen has shown here is this young farmer at the top left of the screen here. This young farmer is literally in the dock, being rebuked by the minister at point blank range in the Kirk on 3 successive Sundays for his intemperate, amorous behavior towards the young lady who's the bottom center of this image. Also note, bottom left, sunk in gloom, despondency, and in shame are the father and the mother of the young farmer above them. He having brought disgrace upon the family because of his amorous activities. And bottom right, you can see the beadle chasing dogs out of the Kirk. All sorts of wonderful images here of the Kirk of that era. Note also below the minister is the precentor. And in front of the precentor, if I could put the cursor on it, that is the hourglass. That is a 60-minute hourglass, which might be turned twice during the sermon in those days. But most importantly, we think of what happened to Burns. This young farmer is getting both barrels at point blank range for the minister, but his day's not over, because if we tighten up, if we enlarge on the image below, look at this. Here's her mother. Look at the body language here. This young man is not out of the Kirk yet. He's not home yet. And so we will charitably presume, gentlemen, that the 2 young lovers were eventually to be united in holy matrimony, just as Burns would be with Jean Armour Burns to the end of his life. Bringing on that concept of young Jean Armour, whom Burns married in Mauchline here in 1788, we had no image of the young Jean. All we had when all this work on imaging began was the painting of the old lady, Jean, her later years in the 19th century. And so with the help of the police forces, both here in Scotland and with the FBI at Washington, DC, we were able to use modern digital technology to regress Jean from the old lady you see here to the young Jean. And she was regressed to the age of 28 when she married Burns. And this is the nearest, I guess, we will ever have to seeing Bonnie Jean, the poet's faithful and beloved wife. He was lucky to have her. She was a fine woman and remained so to the end of her days. And to end this section of Ayrshire, I thought we might look at that, Douglas and Jim. This is Lord Weir, the chairman of Weir Pumps, one of Scotland's great engineering companies in Glasgow. And I remember meeting Lord Weir at a function in London where I was giving a lecture. And he came to see me and said, "You're the chap very interested in Burns." And I said, "I am indeed." He said, "I am a direct descendant." And I am not easily astonished, but I remember being utterly astonished at hearing from his lordship that he was a direct descendant, because many, quote, direct descendants, unquote, have appeared down the years, as you and I both know, none of them proving to be actually directly descended from the poet. So I said, "Lord Weir, pray, from which of the poet's children are you descended?" And he said, "I am a descendant of Dearbot Bess." And I thought, oh, well done. Dearbot Bess, of course, was Elizabeth Peyton of Largyside, the first of the poet's girlfriends to bear a child to him. And I said, so I see, Lord Weir, you are descended from the poet's ill-begotten daughter. And he said, you can put it that way if you like. I am actually descended from his bastard Wayne, which is the way the poet himself described his child. So wonderful. And I thought to myself, how wonderful that the poet's shade in heaven looks down with a smile to see that the only direct descendant of his body in Ayrshire is a member of the House of Lords. So that concludes the section I had on Ayrshire. Happy to discuss.
I just think it's fascinating being able to tell a story with such great images. and it's tremendous that you've got the ability to almost match images which at the time that they were created obviously were created for a different purpose, but match them into a story to make it so interesting.
Yeah, it's great to be able to do that, and we're helped, of course, all of us who do this, by the fact that it's such a good story.
Yeah.
The story of Burns, the biography of Burns, is itself utterly fascinating, not just in itself, in his journey as a poet and then songwriter and song collector, but also in the terms of the great 18th century, because we must never forget that Burns was born right at the heat of the Enlightenment, the Scottish Enlightenment, which was the intellectual epicenter of Europe. And I'm not exaggerating here. Nothing in London or Paris or Berlin or anywhere else matched what was going on in this country at that time. The great stars, of course, are David Hume, the philosopher, Adam Smith, the great economist, James Hutton, who began the science of geology, but also Burns himself, and later Walter Scott, two of the great writers that Scotland would produce. And so that's part of a great story, and all the better for having images to back it up.
Yeah, and when you imagine Burns's life at that time in Mauchline or in Ayrshire, and you look at the modern day Ayrshire, it's sometimes quite difficult to appreciate, you know, how difficult the life was going to be for him, or how difficult life was for him, with the quality of the land and such like. So sometimes these older images help with that.
That's right. Yes, you're quite right. The labour involved in farming in Ayrshire in the 18th century was something we can hardly conceive of now. He needed 4 horses to pull the plough through that heavy loam of Nether Mosgiel, which was his farm, of course, in Ayrshire, after his father died, and he and Gilbert took on the farm after Loch Lee, Mosgiel, just outside Mauchline. Yeah, and this comes out in the poetry, the sheer difficulty that was involved with actually ploughing the land, sowing the seed, and harvesting the crops in the autumn. Yeah.
Looking at that image of Loch Lee, they must have been hardy to survive in, you know, the sort of conditions that they were in at the time.
Yes, there was a very considerable mortality, not just among children, but among adults too in the 18th century. Several of the Burns children died in infancy. His brother John died as a teenager. And Burns himself had a narrow squeak when he caught rheumatic fever in Irvine when he was 21. Rheumatic fever can be fatal, but he survived it. But as we'll see later, the cardiac, that is the heart complications of rheumatic fever, were eventually to end the poet's life at the age of 37 in Dumfries.
Well, perhaps having talked a little bit about Ayrshire, we need to let you move on to the Edinburgh section.
So, Douglas, Jim, from Ayrshire, the poet moved to our capital city, from which I'm speaking to you now, of course, to city of Edinburgh. And what was very important to understand is how he got there. And the reason that he got there was largely due to the gentleman you see sitting on Burns's right, that is his left as you look at the image. This is the Manse of Loudon in the Irvine Valley in Ayrshire. And the gentleman on Burns's right is the Reverend Archibald Laurie, who is the minister of the kirk in New Mills in the Irvine Valley. And they're listening to his daughter playing the spinet. This was the first time we hear from Burns that he ever heard the spinet, a forerunner of the harpsichord and the piano, being played. But Archibald Laurie was a great admirer of Burns's poetry. He had just published the Kilmarnock edition, which was to begin his reputation as a literary writer. And Archibald Laurie sent a copy of the Kilmarnock edition to a friend and colleague of his, another minister of the kirk in Edinburgh. And so the Reverend Archibald Laurie parcels up his copy of the Kilmarnock edition, which had been published in August 1786, sent it off to Edinburgh. Here, this is West Nicholson Street, this photograph taken 100 years ago, and this is the house of the blind poet. It is now a restaurant actually called The Blind Poet, and is one of the meeting places of the Crocallan Fencibles, I'm happy to say. Many a happy evening held in there. But here, this was the home of the poet, the Reverend Thomas Blacklock. And he received the Commonic edition from the Reverend Laurie, but was unable to read it because Blacklock had been blinded at birth, just after birth, by smallpox. So he put the poems beside him and waited for somebody to visit him who would be able to read these poems to him. He also, of course, had the covering letter from the Reverend Laurie saying that these were poems by an Ayrshire farmer, which Laurie thought had merit. And he wondered if Thomas Blacklock thought so too, because Blacklock was one of the major literary critics of the time of the Scottish Enlightenment in Edinburgh. The poems were read to the Reverend Thomas Blacklock by the man who lived here. This is Catron Bank House, just a few miles from Burns's farm at Mosgiel. And this was the home of Professor Dugald Stewart, Professor of Moral Philosophy at the University of Edinburgh. And he was the man who visited Blacklock and was given the Commonic edition and asked to read it. And the two of them, we can only imagine the sheer surprise and delight at finding they were reading poems of real intrinsic literary merit. And Blacklock, we think, said to Dugald Stewart, when you go back to Catron Bank House, Dugald, send for Burns, dine with him, and tell him that he must not go west, because Burns at that time was minded to take up a job as the bookkeeper on an estate in Jamaica. It was a sugar estate, and he was to be the bookkeeper in the office. Some of us feel that that might not have been Burns's ultimate intention, that like many Scots of the time, he might have gone on from the West Indies to the then young United States. Anyway, Professor Dugald Stewart comes back to Ayrshire, sends for Burns. There is a celebrated dinner party, which Burns describes in one of his poems. And Dugald Stewart says to him, Burns, your poems have real merit. Do not go west, go east. When I go back to the university for the autumn term, you come to Edinburgh at the back end of this year, and I will introduce you to one or two individuals who will help you perhaps to bring out a second edition of your poems. And so Dugald Stewart, whose memorial is here, this is the memorial to Dugald on the Carlton Hill in Edinburgh with the new town in the background and the Pentland Hills away in the distance. He was a great man in many senses in the Scottish Enlightenment, not least because he played a major role in the discovery of Burns, because the poet went to Edinburgh and began to meet the stars of the Enlightenment that we've mentioned earlier. And this, for example, is the Great Meeting. This is the painting by Charles Hardy of the one and only gathering which brought together Burns, standing on the left here, with the 15-year-old apprentice in his father's law office. And that is the man that we celebrate this very year in his 250th anniversary of birth. For this is the young Walter Scott. And this is the only meeting between our greatest poets and our greatest novelist. And also, while we're on looking at this image, on the far left, poking the fire, is Professor Ferguson, Adam Ferguson, who is the founder of the discipline of sociology. On the far right of the image is James Hutton, who founded the discipline of geology. And two along from Hutton is Adam Smith, whose great book, The Wealth of Nations, is the foundation document of modern economics. So this was the introduction of Burns to Edinburgh society at the very highest level. The only great star missing is the man whose empty chair is in the foreground. And that is the great philosopher David Hume, whose books Burns had read and who he was able to discuss with Dugald Stewart and others during his stay in town. And let me finish the Edinburgh section with this. This is a remarkable image, and this just shows how valuable it is to have the National Archive of Image at our disposal. This painting, and this is an engraving from the painting, was made in November 1786, the very month in which Burns arrived in Edinburgh. So we are now looking from the old town of Edinburgh. We're looking north across the partially drained North Loch, which you can see here. And we're looking across the North Bridge, which you can see on the right of the image, to the new town of Edinburgh. And if you look at the left-hand edge of the North Bridge, look, you can see the very first houses of Princess Street beginning to rise as the new town began to take shape. And away in the distance, the River Forth with shipping on it and the hills of Fife. And this is exactly what Burns would have seen as he checked into the boarding house of Mrs. Carfrae in the Lawnmark in Edinburgh in that early winter of 1786, 1787. And to end that section, finally, this is the man who was delighted to see him. Apart from Dougal Stewart that we've mentioned, this is James Cunningham, the Earl of Glencairn, and the owner of vast estates in north of Ayrshire, who is also extremely proud to be associated with such a budding genius of a poet. James Cunningham was Burns's particular patron in Edinburgh, introduced him into society and promoted, as we shall see, the second edition of his poems, the great Edinburgh edition, which would establish his reputation for all time.
Can I ask a wee question about Dr. Blacklock? You talked about him not being able to see, being blind as a result of smallpox. To what extent was smallpox rife in these times? And I read somewhere recently, actually, in your encyclopedia about inoculation for smallpox. Was that just coming in at that stage?
It was being experimented on at that stage, Douglas. Dr. Jenner, who is much revered in my own profession of medicine, was the man who came up with the idea that milkmaids didn't seem to get smallpox. How could that be? Because they were exposed to the little disease or the cutaneous disease, that's a skin disease, of cowpox through their work milking cows. And he thought, correctly as it turned out, that perhaps exposure to cowpox conferred immunity against the smallpox agent, which turned out to be a virus, of course, and so it was. But by that time, we're talking about, in Burns's day, inoculation was not yet widely practiced. And one of the victims of it, of course, was Thomas Blacklock. But not just smallpox, but cholera, dysentery, infectious disease were still rife. You've only got to look at an Edinburgh graveyard of that era to see how rapidly individuals died, especially children. We mentioned Walter Scott there. Walter Scott survived an attack of polio, but his previous 6 siblings, 6 brothers and sisters before his birth, all died of communicable disease, of infectious disease in Edinburgh. And of course, this was not a poor indigent family. Walter Scott's mum was the daughter of the professor of medicine. His father was a successful lawyer. It didn't matter who you were in danger of infectious disease, as we still are, of course, at the moment from viruses. But in those days, there was no protection, no treatment. And the results were a terrible harvest of young lives from disease, of infectious diseases, yeah.
Just, when I'm looking at those images, it took me back to reading the Ferguson poems, and I've often wondered just exactly how Burns would have reacted to seeing Edinburgh and being in Edinburgh for the first time, because it must have been a different world for him.
Yes, it certainly was, and good to hear you mention Robert Ferguson. We haven't touched on him, but back at Loch Lee that we saw earlier, somebody brought to Loch Lee a copy of the works of Ferguson. And that's what really inspired Burns to write in Scots as well as in English. We should never forget that Burns was fully bilingual, as many of us are. I mean, we're speaking to each other in pretty standard English at the moment, but we're quite capable of dropping our doing into the Alt Scots lead without any warning, which is almost incomprehensible to an English audience. And that is what that showed Burns what could be done. The poems of Ferguson showed what could be done with the graphic imagery and the verbal firepower of the old Scots language. And of course, he was to write in both. And Burns himself was bilingual for several reasons, not least his father. William Burns is a much neglected figure in the Burns story, but on Sundays, between sermons, and there were 2 services, remember, in the kirk on the Sabbath in those days, they would go for walks, the father, Robert, and Gilbert. And the rule was that you spoke only standard English. And that resulted in the fact that when Burns arrived in Edinburgh, they expected to get an Ayrshire ploughman speaking broad Ayrshire Lowlands. And in fact, they got a highly educated and articulate young man who spoke fluent Augustan English, as well as the Braid Scots as well, yeah.
Good, good, good. Right, we should let you move on to the next set, I think.
The next set of images, Douglas, Jim, finds us still in Edinburgh. And I've just called this the Rosebud, as you'll see in a moment. Burns often spoke about roses. The great love poem, of course, the Red, Red Rose, is perhaps the most famous of all the love songs which populate his songwriting. Songs of meeting, songs of loving, songs of parting, with that at the center. But there also was a rosebud in his life. And people wondered in his own time and afterwards, well, who or what was this rosebud about which he wrote? And let me just tell that story very briefly. After his reception in Edinburgh and the publication of the great second Edinburgh edition of his poems, Burns set off on a series of tours around Scotland. One that we show here was in a chaise and pair. This is a chaise, which is an 18th century carriage for two individuals in the carriage, luggage on top and behind. A pair being a pair of horses, of course, with John Carnegie, their driver, up on the left-hand horse. And I use this image also to illustrate the fact that some people still seem to believe that Burns was indigent, that he was extremely poor, that he lived a life of poverty. Let me assure you that if you were traveling in the 18th century and you were indigent or poor, you did not, repeat, not travel in one of these. This is the equivalent of a Bentley Landaulet open-topped coupe of the 18th century. And round Scotland went Burns with his great friend Willie Nicol, the Latin and Greek master, classics master of the High School of Edinburgh, collecting songs. And because we must never forget that Burns was not just our greatest poet, he was our greatest songwriter. And not only that, our greatest song collector. Very rarely across the world of literature do you find any country where the greatest poet and the greatest songwriter and the greatest song collector are one and the same person. So looking at his song collection, this is the only image that we have of Burns at work at his song collecting up and down the country. On the left is Burns with his violin. Remember, he could play the violin. He was never a concert violinist, of course, but he could hold a tune on the violin. He's listening to this young lady in the center at her singing. And if you look at the left of the image behind Burns with his fiddle, you can see a book of musical notation. And he would take down the tunes which were being sung by individuals of every rank and station in society, and then bring them back to Edinburgh. So this is him at work on his song collecting up and down the country. Just to take one song, for example, he tells us in his journal that from the borders to the highlands, it was the feeling of the people that the musical tune, Hey Tootie Tatie, was the very tune played on the instruments of the time as the Scottish army advanced onto the field of Bannockburn. And that would be the basis of the tune that he would set to the great song, which is popularly known as Scots Wha Hae, but whose real title is King Robert's March. And by the way, gentlemen, I think that's what we should sing at Murrayfield, but that's another story. Anyway, back to Edinburgh comes Burns with his songs. And this is a painting that I commissioned from Charles Naismith. Charles is the head of art at one of our great schools of Edinburgh, Stuart Melville College. And this is not conjectural. This is based on an eyewitness account of the room in the family home of the Cruikshanks, another classics master of the Edinburgh High School, where Burns lodged for his second winter in Edinburgh. And this is the parlour of the Cruikshanks' home. Burns at the table, strewn with papers, and at the harpsichord is Jenny Cruikshank, the only child of the family, and she is playing a tune over and over again, and this is again from the eyewitness account, as Burns sits at the table putting words to the tune. that he always worked in that sequence. He always began with the air, with the tune, and would fit the words to it, never the other way around, as many other songwriters had done. And this was a scene which was, I say, personally witnessed by a visitor to Burns, who was not allowed into that room by Mrs. Cruikshank, because she said, well, you must wait, sir, they are at work. And through the door, it could be heard the sound of the tune and the singing of Jenny over and over as Burns married up the words to the air with a facility which will be matched by very few, including Franz Schubert, for example, himself. But who was the Rosebud? Well, you've just seen her. The Rosebud was Jenny Cruikshank. We know about that because Burns wrote a song for her. He wrote the song which was my own mother's favourite song of all the Burns songs, A Rosebud by my early walk, adown a corn enclosed bog. Sae gently bent its thorny stalk, sae early in the morning. And I wondered for years, well, what happened to the Rosebud? She was obviously a great friend of Burns. She was not a girlfriend, of course, in the modern sense. She was only 13 years old, but she was a lady friend, a very young lady friend of the poet. His letters to her father never closed without being asked to be remembered to Mrs. Cruikshank and to the young Rosebud. Burns always paid his dues. He gave Jenny two gifts. One was the great song, A Rosebud by My Early Walk, and the other was a copy of his Edinburgh edition of his poems. But where was she? What happened to her? She vanishes from the Burns story after he leaves Edinburgh. It took me several years, but she's here. This is her at the bottom right of the image that you see here. In the background are the ruins of the great Abbey of Jedburgh down on the borders, because Jenny married a solicitor, a lawyer in Jedburgh, and she was buried here in the kirkyard of Jedburgh Abbey. And when we went to look at the gravestone itself, sadly, the 160 years of acid rain and wind and weather had effaced almost all the writing on the stone. The stone itself is perfect. It's Aberdeen granite. It will last forever. But all the writing, as I say, and as you can see, had been effaced from it. What to do about it? Obviously, we had to restore it. But how to do it? Gosh, and I remember thinking, what permissions and what procedures and, oh, the bureaucracy. But fortunately, I had a chum who was the chairman at that time of the Borders Council. I rang him up and I said, Alistair, how do I go about this? I found the Rosebud, Burns's Rosebud, but she lies in consecrated ground. We don't have a member of the family to whom to seek permission. What do I do to restore the effaced words on her gravestone? And Alistair, wonderfully for a politician, came right to the point. And he said, David, you find a painter in Jedburgh, you pay him, you tell him what is required, and you tell him to get on with it. And David, if anybody objects, anybody, refer them to me. Wonderful. So I got hold of a painter who was used to painting gravestones. I paid him. I told him to get on with it. And 2 weeks later, we had this. In memory of James Henderson, and this was the Rosebud's husband, writer, that is, solicitor in Jedburgh, and Jean Cruikshank, using the name in her birth certificate, known as Jenny and the family, one of Burns's heroines. Absolutely right. Together, they raised a large and successful family, and this gravestone was put up by one of her children, who was a surgeon over the border in Berwick. And he also, we have a letter of his reminding us that in her very last hours, as his mother was dying, with her family around her, she recalled to the family her own happy childhood in her father's house in Edinburgh, and the fact that it was she who had been the Rosebud. One final point about Burns as a songwriter. As I mentioned, we must never forget not just a poet, but a great songwriter too. I asked the University of Glasgow how many songs actually stand to Burns's name today. And I was told that they have worked on it for some years and have come to the conclusion that it was 364 songs both written by Burns and rescued by Burns from his tours around Scotland. Almost a song, Douglas and Jim, for every day of the year. And was he a good songwriter? Well, don't ask me, and I won't ask you. This man thought so, because many of the Burns songs were set to piano and piano trio accompaniment by the greatest composer of Europe, long after Burns's death. And we have a letter in the National Library of Scotland from Beethoven here, expressing to George Thomson, Burns's publisher, his astonishment that Burns had no formal training in musical theory or the practice of composition. Beethoven, the famous painting shown here of the great man, and he's holding, for those of you interested in classical music, he's holding the score of one of his greatest works, the Missa Solemnis.
My question is really about Burns's ability to read music. I mean, we've heard that he always waited until he knew the air before he committed the words to paper. And I often wonder whether he had to get someone to play it, or whether he could actually read or sight read to the extent that he could kind of hum the tune to himself.
Yes, he had there's no doubt that Burns had a very musical ear. We know from his conversation that he was a great mimic, for example. He could imitate other people's accents. And if you have that gene for mimicry, then you have a musical ear, because hearing accents in your head is simply the same facility as hearing music in your head. I'm afraid that I have that gene for mimicry too. It's by no means an unalloyed asset in life, I can tell you. And I play piano by ear. I'm completely useless at sight reading, but I can hold a tune and play it. Burns was the same. And he was always on the lookout for individuals who could play the harpsichord or the spinet, as we've seen, or who were singers. His wife, Jean Armour Burns, for example, was a great singer. And he often talks about her beautiful pipe, that is her voice. And of course, for Jenny Cruikshank that we've just seen, also a great singer. So he could hold a tune in his head, and then he would write it down on that musical notation that he carried with him on his travels, bring that back to Edinburgh, and then get the words to fit with the air. And we also know that he would sit and listen to the air over and over again himself and decide what emotions came to his mind, which were produced by the musical cadence and the rhythm of the tune itself. And that is the basis of the beauty of the Burns songs, I think. They can be actually read as poetry. And that's quite unusual, because the lyrics of a song are no more a poem than the libretto of an opera is a play. But he has that ability to transpose the images of the produced by the air into words themselves, and to marry them into the cadence and rhythm of the music with the facility which astonished not just Beethoven, as we've mentioned, but Joseph Haydn later, and Felix Mendelssohn, who also set many of the Burns songs for piano and musical accompaniment.
Yeah.
There's a letter somewhere where Burns writes, "I am a fiddler and a poet." Do you think he's making any kind of assertion there?
Yes, he's just reminding us that he was indeed an adept on the fiddle at holding tunes. He was not you'd never have Burns playing Beethoven's violin concerto, for example, but give him a good folk song and he would see it, hear it, remember it, transcribe it, and take it back to put the words to it. He had the full set of abilities to turn what had been a simple air into a fully finished song. And remember, Jim, that when he was traveling around Scotland, many of the tunes that he heard had lost their words. And when he was traveling around collecting these songs, many of them were just dying for want of being transcribed and published and set to music. So many of the songs had lost all of their words. Some of them only had a title. And sometimes Burns had only the title to go on to discover what had been the substance and the words which had once existed, along with the tune itself. So he was a resurrectionist for our songs, as well as their transcriber and publisher. From his traveling around Scotland collecting songs, Burns moved on to his last effort in farming. And this is the earliest images we have of the farm of Ellisland, which sat on the bluff above the right bank of the River Nith, 7 or 8 miles above the town of Dumfries in Lower Nithsdale. And here it was that several remarkable events took place. Here he met his great English friend. This is a painting by John Watson Gordon, which in fact is fictional. This is titled Burns in the Home of Francis Grose. Burns was never in the home of Francis Grose. Burns and Francis Grose were in the home of Burns's neighbour at Friars Carse, the great house next to the Farm of Ellisland. But Francis Grose was a very famous man in his own time. He was a multiple author. And in particular, he was the author of the Antiquities of England. He travelled all over England and Wales collecting stories and accounts of ancient monuments, castles, abbeys, etc. And having had great success with that, he came to Scotland to produce a companion volume, The Antiquities of Scotland. And he met Burns, and their host in Dumfriesshire said to Grose, he said, I think you should meet the poet Robert Burns, because he comes from Ayrshire, where you are going next, Francis. Perhaps he will tell you what antiquities in that county should go into your book. And that led to Burns suggesting to Francis Grose, the two of them became great friends, by the way. Francis Grose would have been a great Crocallan fencible, noisy, witty, and a great companion over dinner and an occasional glass of claret. Burns knew that nothing went into the book which was not of great architectural significance or historical relevance. So how to get Alloway Kirk into the book? So he baited the hook by telling Francis that it was well known that after markets in Ayr, farmers would try to get back to their farm in southern Ayrshire, having had 1 or 2 drams in the alehouse in Ayr, and that one farmer in particular went on his way back to his farm past Alloway Kirk, where was going on a witches' Sabbath, with witches and warlocks taking part in a dance, with music provided by the devil himself on the bagpipes. And this is a wonderful image of that witches' Sabbath, with the young witch Nanny here on the right, wearing what is known as a cutty sark. We mentioned the word cutty earlier as meaning short. This cutty sark is a short chemise. So the farmer who is watching from the window is, of course, Tam O'Shanter. He sees this performance going on and is then pursued out over the brig of Alloway and just makes it back to the farm intact, although his horse loses her tail in the process. So that was the connection between Burns and his great friend, Francis Grose. And it's worthwhile just reflecting that Burns had no animosity across the border or with anybody else of any other nationality or any other religion. Burns was wonderfully ecumenical in that. It didn't matter what your religion was or what your nationality was. If you were a good fellow and an honest man, you were good for him. And this is the fact that he was Captain Francis Grose, and a wonderful cartoon of the time showing the captain in charge of the motley crew of the Surrey militia, because Francis came from the home counties, from the county of Surrey. I found him here. This is the gravestone of Francis Grose. I knew that he had died in Ireland, and I was over in Dublin giving a talk some years ago, and after some considerable hunting, I found that he was here. This is the gravestone of Francis Grose in Drumcondra Protestant graveyard in North Dublin. I think I may have been the first visitor to the grave for maybe a century. So I left some flowers on it and expressed to his memory or to his shade how grateful we were that he had agreed to put Alloway Kirk into his great book, The Antiquities of Scotland. And as a footnote to that entry, we have the most marvelous poem, the greatest narrative poem in the language, Tam O'Shanter himself. And before we leave Ellisland, let me just show you this. You can see from the date of this photograph that it's 2011. I was told by a friend on the borders that there perhaps was at Flores Castle in near Kelso in the Borders, a letter by Burns. I said to my friend Walter Elliott, who told me about this, well, I said, Walter, it's almost certainly a fake, because many, quote, letters by Burns, unquote, appear down the years. They're all fakes. But send it up to me in Edinburgh, have it scanned and email it up, and I'll have a look at it and tell you. It came up to Edinburgh, and immediately I thought, this is a very, very good fake, or else it just might be the real thing. And so, to cut a long story very short, my friend Ian Gordon Brown, curator of manuscript at the National Library here in Edinburgh, he and I went to Flores Castle to meet the Duke of Roxburgh, who showed me this book of his containing what was an unpublished letter of Burns. It's a letter which Burns wrote to my colleague, Professor James Gregory in Edinburgh, Professor of Medicine, describing a poem on seeing a wounded hare, because Burns was sowing his grass seed one morning when he heard a gunshot from the next meadow. He dropped his sowing sheet and went into the next meadow to find the huntsman who had fired the gun, because the victim of the gunshot was a doe hare, a female hare, which limped past Burns as he was sowing his grass seed. And Burns immediately dropped the sheet, jumped the dike, went into the next meadow and found that the man who had fired the shot was the son of the neighboring farmer. There followed a tremendous confrontation between Burns and the young man, because it was April. And in April, all doe hares have leverets. And now the leverets were also going to die. And 50 years after the event, Burns was being written about in the first great biography by Robert Chambers of Edinburgh, who was down in Dumfriesshire meeting people who had met Burns in the flesh. And he met the now old man who had been the boy who fired the shot. And he remembered it as if it had been yesterday. He said, the poet was in a towering rage. He threatened to throw me into the Nith if I ever did something like that again. And that just shows again, Douglas, Jim, that just shows the poet's love for anything that lived on the land, the flora and the fauna. Everything was within his range, everything within his affection. And this is the South Park of Ellisland Farm with the River Nith on the right. This is where the confrontation took place. And as we leave Ellisland, one final look at the poet's sense of humor. From the dress of these children, I think this must be the 1950s. You may not be able to read the poetry on the 4 lines of the gate, which is at the road end of Ellisland, where the road end joins the A76, the main road from Kilmarnock to Dumfries. Be ye man or be ye woman, be ye going or be ye coming, be ye early, be ye late, you be sure to lock this gate.
Very good.
Let's move just straight on to a very short section on Burns abroad, huh? Let us have one brief look at the poet abroad, away from Scotland. Burns was taken by our emigrants in large numbers to Canada and to the United States in North America. When the families packed to go, into the family kist would go their family possessions, probably the good book and a copy of the collected works. And Burns contributed to one of the less savory aspects of life in North America, which of course was the use of African labor, slave labor, on the estates of Virginia. And he wrote one of his great songs called The Slave's Lament, describing the abduction of a black slave from Senegal and his translation to the cotton fields of Virginia. It was one of Burns's great songs and one of his contributions to the anti-slavery movement. And how appropriate, therefore, that one of his greatest admirers in North America was the man who did free the slaves. And if you read his biography, you'll find that every night that he spent in the White House, on the bedside table was a copy of the Bible and a copy of the collected works, which had been read to him, and the copy given to him by his father, Tom. This is Abraham Lincoln, of course. His father, Tom Lincoln, gave this to his son in the log cabin when he was growing up in the great state of Kentucky. And how remarkable that a century later, this man, Cassius Clay, came to Burns Cottage. Cassius Clay was then, this is 1960, the light heavyweight gold medalist from the Summer Olympic Games in Rome. His aircraft on a way back to the States was being refueled at Prestwick Airport. He expressed a desire to come to Burns Cottage at Alloway. And here is Cassius Clay, long before, by the way, he changed his name to Muhammad Ali and embraced Islam. He's holding the spinning wheel of Robert Burns's mother, with in the background the image of the poet. And he recited, we understand, a small section of that very song, The Slave's Lament. And when the curator of Burns Cottage expressed his delight and astonishment that Cassius knew the song, he pointed out that his people knew who had been active in the anti-slavery movement, and that his own great-grandfather had been a slave. We've just seen the 16th president of the United States, Abraham Lincoln. Here's the first one. And here is the buff and the blue uniform, the colors which Burns wore on his own waistcoat of General George Washington, who was one of the subscribers to the very first edition of Burns's poems in the United States. A look at one of our emigrants to America, and a very famous one. This is John Muir from Dunbar, who with President Teddy Roosevelt was to found Yosemite National Park and the whole concept of national parks for the conservation of nature in that great country. After 3 years of farming the stony ground of Ellisland, Burns moved into the town of Dumfries, where his last 5 years would be spent. This was the family home. It is now Burns Street. As you can see, it's a substantial two-story detached house. And here he lived with Jean and their growing family, working now as an officer of the Excise Service, which is the forerunner of our beloved HMRC, and for our American viewers, the forerunner of the IRS, the Inland Revenue Service. He was also heavily armed, remember, at this time, something which is quite often forgotten. I used to tell audiences that this image shows Burns's musket, which he carried on his walks, in fact, on his rides as an officer of the Excise Service. These officers had to be armed because smuggling was rife in the country, and smugglers themselves were armed and full of fight because they knew what would happen to them if they were caught. I used to tell audiences that this was Burns's musket, but I stopped that when my soldier son came home from his last tour of duty with his regiment in Afghanistan and stopped me and said, "Daddy, that is not a musket." I said, "Really? So what is it?" And it was interesting, he said, Arkley said, that's not a musket, that's a carbine. What was Burns doing with a carbine? And that carbine turns out to be really a sawn-off musket. It's a short-range weapon for use over 10 to 20 yards range, as opposed to a musket, which was for use over 200 or 300 yards by infantry in the army, as we shall see in a moment. So this is a 4-bore musket with a stock and barrel, which is made of teak, and it is with brass fittings. It was a formidable weapon. It's not so much a rifle as it is in fact a small cannon. This is a musket, and this is Burns illustrated by an artist of the time and viewed as he would have appeared in his uniform as a soldier in the Royal Dumfries Volunteers. And in his right hand, he is carrying a musket. And this is the standard infantry issue of that time, the famous Brown Bess musket used in the Napoleonic Wars. By this time, however, he was dying. He died fairly rapidly over the course of 1795 and into the summer of 1796. And we are still not entirely sure what the problem was. This is the last image of him, painted in Dumfries within 10 months of his death. You can't make a diagnosis from a painting, but it doesn't look, to me as a doctor, doesn't look like somebody who is at the point of death. But he was carried to his interment in St. Michael's Kirkyard by his comrades of the Royal Dumfries Volunteers, here shown in the red coats of their parade uniform, Burns in the coffin with his soldiers sword and his hat on the coffin, and preceded by the piper in front of 10,000 people who had shown up unbidden to the funeral. It was a beautiful day, as was the following day. And as his great biographer Hans Hecht observes, the sun that rose the next morning over the sleeping town, casting his rays over the fresh earth of that new grave, was indeed the sun of immortality. What killed the poet? We're not entirely certain, as I've mentioned. We've had many meetings about the subject. This is one of the advertisements for a conference on the disease which took the poet from us at the age of 37. It was, if you permit me to show one of my images from my medical teaching days, it was this. It was the heart disease, which is the sequela of the acute rheumatic fever, which afflicted him as a 21-year-old in Irvine. There was no formal treatment for it in Burns's time. They sent him to sea bathing in the freezing waters of the Solway. Here at the Brow Well, you're looking south across the Solway to the hills of Cumberland over the border in England in the distance there. This was not a treatment as was hoped at the time. It was in fact a death sentence for the poet. He died of endocarditis, which is the terminal event in rheumatic heart disease. We would treat it today with penicillin, and we would cure it with penicillin, but of course there was none for Burns. It was to be 80 years after his death that another farmer's son would be born in Ayrshire, another Ayrshirman of genius, this man, Alexander Fleming, who would make that most momentous of medical discoveries and earn a well-deserved Nobel Prize for Medicine in the late 1940s. And remember also that Burns died twice. Not only his physical death in Dumfries that day in 1796, but then he was assassinated in terms of his memory by the brave man who did not put his name to an obituary in the Edinburgh Evening Courant, suggesting that the poet had died of alcoholism. And that hair was started running and has not entirely stopped. It was not true. He died of heart disease, but it was said and set about that perhaps drink had played a role in his demise. He was vigorously defended by Jean Armour, his brave wife, who lived for another 38 years, her widowhood being 1 year longer than the poet's life itself. She raised the children and saw them off into careers in the world, two of her younger sons being both colonels of the Indian Army at the end of their military careers. And he was physically defended also by the youngest of his sisters. But there are no photographs of Burns, of course. He died long before photography, but he was the eldest of the family and died young. The youngest of the family, Isabel here, died old. And this is one of the very first photographs ever taken of a portrait of a lady. And this is Isabel at the age of 72, where she was photographed by David Octavius Hill, Scotland's first great photographer, at her cottage outside Ayr. And let me just mention this man, because he is a great colleague of ours. This is Sir James Crichton Browne, the man who refused to believe that Burns had died an alcoholic, and who was able to show that it was heart disease that killed him. He pointed out that Burns was listed for promotion within the excise service. That's something that does not happen to alcoholics, and that the military records of the Dumfries volunteers showed no evidence of any misbehavior in that regard by the soldier. And so there you have it, gentlemen. There is a review of a life, a remarkable life and a legacy, which is with us yet. And let us pray always will be. And let us pray that come it may, as come it will for all that. That sense and worth or all the earth shall bear the gree and all that, for all that and all that coming yet, for all that. That brand to man the world o'er. May brothers be, for all that. And keeping all that going is the Newcombe Burns Club, with whom it has been such a pleasure to gather this morning and to review the life of this remarkable man of ours. Thank you both. Yeah, right.
Thank you very much, David. That was excellent.
cut and paste.
Well, that was tremendous. The illustrations just bring all of that story so much to life.
They do, and they're still coming. The flow of new images about the poet and his life has slowed to a trickle, but they are still appearing. That photograph of Isabel Burns that I showed you, that only came to light a few years ago. But audiences still go very quiet when I tell them, this is not a painting, this is not an engraving, this is a living photograph of the poet's wee sister. She was a remarkable woman, Isabel Burns. She was widowed young, she had many kids to look after, she raised them all. She was given a pension by Queen Victoria to help her to carry on with her life and to continue the remembrance of her brother. Which was a mark of respect, which illustrates just how valuable Burns was seen by the nation into the 19th century.
Yeah, very much so.
I often think it's ironic, though, David, that you know, we tend to remember Burns in many ways in this country through incomplete, surmised, incorrect biographies written by people who collected, obviously, the information at the time. And we remember him for character faults rather than for the beautiful stuff that he left us that forms the background of the backbone of our national culture in terms of literature and songs.
That's right. But yeah, quite agree. It is remarkable and reprehensible that that canard of drink being the cause of death is still alive in some parts of the world. One of the greatest defenses of him came from James Gray, who was the rector of Dumfries Academy, who wrote a wonderful letter to one of Burns's biographers who had continued this story of drink being a problem. And it's a wonderful letter. And James Gray says, I am a minister of the kirk, and I was the rector of Dumfries Academy. And in the 5 years that Burns lived in this town, I saw him almost every day. And never once in that 5 years of experience did I observe him affected by alcohol. Where is this coming from? Name the man who says that the poet was a slave to drink, and I will speak and confront that person. It's a wonderful defense. James Gray also adds, I had the honor of educating his sons. I knew the family well, and I'm happy to defend them in any circumstance.
And that's it. Just let me finish off by saying a huge thank you to you for giving up your time and showing us these illustrations along with your fantastic knowledge of Burns. And really just to say thanks for telling us about your life with Robert Burns. Thank you, David.
Douglas, I did not give up my time. I enhanced my time. It was always a pleasure to be involved with several times down the years with New Cumnock. And I will, of course, come back to New Cumnock at any time it should please the committee to invite me to do so and bring the new images with me to see you all again.